The grim and exhausting monotony of life in the German POW camp had long since worn away the resolve of the British soldiers who found themselves confined within its barbed wire fences. The prisoners were not the proud and strong men they had once been, marching into battle with the certainty of purpose and the pride of their nation behind them. Now they were shells of those men, emaciated, hollow-eyed, and broken. Their spirits had been chipped away by the constant brutality of their captors, the never-ending hunger, and the relentless physical labor. They moved mechanically through each day, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, as though their bodies had learned to function without any real willpower. They were not just physically exhausted, they were spiritually drained, their identities eroded by months of cruel treatment and the overwhelming despair of knowing that escape or rescue was almost certainly out of reach. Each day began the same. A cold, gray sky broke over the camp, casting long shadows over the barracks that seemed to sag under the weight of the prisoners' collective suffering. The distant clanging of metal echoed across the compound as the guards prepared for the routine of the day. The prisoners had long since ceased to hope for anything other than the unyielding rhythm of their existence. Food was sparse, and what little they received was often spoiled or inedible. Their clothes were ragged, their bodies covered in sores from a lack of proper hygiene. It wasn't just the hunger and cold that gnawed at them, it was the constant reminder that they were less than human in the eyes of their captors. The German guards moved with a precision that matched the mechanical nature of the camp. They barked orders in harsh tones, and every movement, every glance from the prisoners was scrutinized with an unyielding cruelty. The prisoners knew the drill: stand in line, heads down, eyes straight ahead. The guards would inspect them, take note of any weakness, any sign of defiance. If a prisoner made the mistake of making eye contact or showing a hint of resistance, there would be punishment. It could be a blow to the back, a hard kick to the stomach, or, in extreme cases, solitary confinement in the freezing cold. No prisoner was safe, no one was exempt from the violence of the guards, and no one dared to show anything less than submission. Yet, despite the overwhelming oppression, there was still a sliver of defiance deep within the men. It had become almost subconscious, a quiet act of resistance that existed in the very air they breathed. They no longer feared the physical punishment in the same way. It had become a part of their reality, an inevitable consequence of their imprisonment. But the deeper indignities, the daily humiliations, the stripping away of their dignity, those were harder to bear. It wasn't the beatings that broke them. It was the endless small acts of dehumanization. The way their captors treated them as nothing more than expendable objects. In the silence of the night, many of the prisoners would silently curse their captors, but there was little more they could do. They were beaten down, not just physically but mentally, by a system that seemed designed to erase them. Then came that fateful day when the sun hung heavy in the gray sky, and the camp seemed quieter than usual. The prisoners stood in the usual formation for the daily roll call. The air was thick with the familiar tension of waiting for the day's ordeal to begin. Each man stood at attention, their breath coming in shallow gasps, their faces etched with the marks of months of suffering. Their bodies were weary from the long days of forced labor, and the thin layers of clothing they wore offered little protection from the cold winds that howled through the camp. The guards stood at their posts, eyes scanning the rows of men, their faces as hard as stone. They were indifferent to the suffering around them, their expressions blank and unreadable. These men had long since ceased to be individuals in the eyes of their captors. They were nothing more than nameless, faceless prisoners. It was in this moment, as the prisoners waited for the inevitable shout to march to their next task, that something unusual happened. A British officer, whose once pristine uniform had long since been reduced to rags, took a step forward. He had been silent for most of the time in the camp, his eyes heavy with the weight of all that he had witnessed. His name was Captain Edward Harris, a man who had once been a leader, who had once given orders and held his men in high regard. But now he was like the others, tired, broken, stripped of everything that had made him who he was. Yet in this moment, something stirred within him. It was not anger. It was not defiance in the way that one might expect. It was the realization that even in this hell, even in the deepest pit of despair, there might still be a flicker of something that could restore a sense of humanity. Captain Harris stepped forward, his body stiff and unsteady from months of maltreatment. He was not thinking clearly, not planning some grand scheme of rebellion, but his actions spoke louder than any words could have. He approached one of the German guards, his hand trembling slightly as he reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. He didn't speak at first, and the guard looked at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Captain Harris held out the envelope, the weight of his request almost too much to bear. He asked, in his soft, hoarse voice, if he could send a letter home. The guard studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The tension was palpable, the stillness in the air thick with anticipation. The other prisoners, standing just out of sight, could not believe what they were witnessing. No one had ever dared to ask for something so trivial, so human, as to send a letter. It was a small thing, a simple request, but in this place, in this moment, it felt like an act of revolution. To everyone's surprise, the guard gave a small nod and motioned for Captain Harris to write. There was no shouting, no punishment, just a silent acknowledgement of the officer's request. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of this moment. Was it a trap? Was this some kind of cruel joke? But Captain Harris, still weak from months of neglect, sat down on the cold ground and began to write, his hand shaking as he composed the simplest of messages. A letter home to his wife, telling her that he was alive and that he would return one day. It was a small thing, but in the harsh, bleak confines of the camp, it was a light that cut through the darkness. The other prisoners, seeing this quiet act of defiance, were at first unsure of how to react. They had been conditioned to expect nothing but pain, humiliation, and despair. They had long since stopped dreaming of normalcy. And yet, in the quiet act of writing a letter, something profound began to stir within them. One by one, they began to step forward. The first man to follow suit was Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, a grizzled veteran of the war who had witnessed horrors no man should ever see. His hands, scarred and shaking from years of fighting, clutched a piece of scrap paper, and he too asked for permission to write. The guard, still unsure but unable to stop this strange unfolding of events, nodded once more. Before long, more and more men were approaching the guards, each one asking, not for a meal or for reprieve, but for the simplest of human needs, the chance to send a letter home. The letters were not just messages of survival. They were an assertion of life, of humanity, in the face of death. As the men wrote, they were not merely prisoners, they were sons, fathers, brothers, friends. They were not defined by their status as captives, but by the connections they still held to the world outside. This was a world where men still cared for one another, where families still existed, even if the soldiers had to imagine them from behind the cold bars of their prison. In that moment the camp changed. The prisoners, so long resigned to their fate, began to feel something they hadn't felt in what seemed like years, a spark of hope. Not in the sense that they believed they would be freed tomorrow, but in the deeper, quieter sense that they were not entirely lost. In the quiet exchange of letters, they found their humanity again. The air inside the camp had always been thick with tension, but now, something had shifted. What began as an isolated, almost impossible gesture by Captain Edward Harris had rippled through the prisoner ranks, carrying with it the weight of something far more significant than the mere act of writing a letter. It was the sudden, unmistakable realization that the men, once reduced to mere shadows of themselves, were reclaiming something intangible, their dignity. For weeks, months, they had lived under the oppressive heel of their captors, existing in a state of constant fear, barely able to recall who they had been before the war had stolen everything from them. Their lives had been stripped away by the war machine, leaving only exhaustion, hunger, and helplessness behind. But now, in the quiet solitude of that brief and unexpected moment, there had been a glimpse of something that felt almost like resistance. And it wasn't born from violence, nor was it born from anger. It was a simple act of communication, one that resonated deeply in a place where every aspect of their lives had been controlled and twisted into something unrecognizable. As Captain Harris sat on the cold, hard ground, writing his letter with trembling hands, the guards watched him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. No one had ever asked to write home before, not in this way, not in the midst of this relentless war. The request itself seemed absurd, even fragile in its simplicity, yet there was something so profoundly human about it that the guard could not bring himself to refuse. The permission granted, though, was not just a gesture of kindness. It was a crack in the iron structure of the camp, a tiny breach that no one could have anticipated. It was as though time had momentarily stood still, and the men who had been nothing more than victims of violence were offered, for a fleeting moment, a small taste of the life they had once known. The other prisoners, though, stood in stunned silence. They had been waiting for the usual barrage of insults or blows. They had been prepared for the worst, as they always had been. But this was different. They had witnessed something that seemed almost impossible in a place like this. They had seen a prisoner, broken in body yet still retaining the strength to act with dignity, reach out for the simplest of human needs, a connection to the outside world. What had begun as a single act of quiet defiance was now slowly becoming something larger, something that extended beyond the boundaries of individual survival. It was the first step toward reclaiming their humanity. The men had learned to expect nothing but abuse, to live as though they were no longer seen as human beings by their captors. But in this unexpected moment, something had shifted. They were not just prisoners of war anymore. They were men. They were people with families, with lives waiting for them outside these prison walls. They had not been entirely erased. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes was the first to approach the guards after Harris. His hand was stiff, his movements slow, yet there was an unmistakable spark of purpose in his eyes. He had witnessed the horrors of war in ways that most men would never be able to fully comprehend. He had seen his comrades fall, had fought battles that seemed endless, and had suffered physical and emotional wounds that would never fully heal. But in that moment, as he watched Harris write his letter, something stirred in him, a realization that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to claw back from the brink of despair. He too stepped forward, his voice low and hesitant as he made the request to write a letter home. At first, the guard stood motionless, his expression unreadable, but then, after a long pause, he nodded. And so, Lieutenant Hayes, though weary and hollowed by the passage of time in the camp, sat down beside Harris and began to write his own letter. There was something deeply personal about the act of writing. In that small space, with a pen scratching against the paper, these men who had been nothing but victims of a larger, faceless conflict were given a means to express their emotions, to lay bare their souls in a way that had been denied them for so long. They wrote not just to inform their families that they were alive, but to remind themselves that they still existed beyond the physical confines of the camp. The letters were a declaration of the self, an assertion of the inner life that no amount of brutality could completely extinguish. Soon, more men began to approach the guards, each of them making their own tentative request. The atmosphere in the camp shifted ever so slightly, a current of something new, something fragile, passing through the barracks. The prisoners, once so resigned to their fate, were beginning to act. There was no great plan, no coordinated effort to stage a full rebellion. This was not an armed uprising. This was something subtler, something quieter. It was an act of personal autonomy in a place where the very essence of individuality had been stripped away. These men were taking back the small part of themselves that had not been lost in the relentless machinery of war. They were sending letters home, letters to their wives, their mothers, their children. They were sharing their thoughts and their hopes, however faint, with the world beyond the wire. The guards, at first disoriented by the prisoners' behavior, stood at a loss for how to respond. They had been trained to expect one thing: subjugation. To them, the idea of a prisoner asking for something as innocuous as a letter was foreign. They had spent months enforcing the belief that these men were nothing but animals, that they were less than human, that their spirits had been broken. But now, in the quiet defiance of the written word, the guards found themselves confronted with something they hadn't prepared for. The prisoners were not simply sitting down in submission, waiting to be pushed around. They were asserting their own will, claiming something for themselves that the guards could neither control nor understand. This moment marked the beginning of an evolution within the camp. What had begun as a series of small, personal rebellions became something larger, a silent, collective act of resistance. Though the prisoners did not openly defy the guards, They began to understand the power of their own agency. They were not just waiting for the next blow or the next round of humiliation. They were choosing to engage with the world, to connect with the people they loved, even if only through the fragile medium of a letter. It was an act of solidarity that reverberated through the barracks. The men who had once walked with heads lowered, eyes vacant, began to look up, to hold themselves differently, to understand that they were not defined by the suffering they endured. The letters themselves were not just messages of survival. They became something more profound. For the prisoners, each letter was a lifeline, a tether to a world outside that still valued them, still saw them as human. The words they wrote, simple as they were, became an act of self-affirmation. They reminded them that they were not lost, that they still had identities beyond the walls of the camp. They were fathers, sons, husbands, brothers, and friends. They were men with hopes, dreams, and stories that stretched beyond the confines of this place. They were not just bodies to be broken, but individuals whose worth could not be reduced to a number on a ledger. The exchange of letters became a quiet revolution within the camp. It was not a revolution that would shake the foundations of the German military or lead to the sudden liberation of the prisoners. It was a revolution of spirit, a reclaiming of what it meant to be human in a world that sought to strip them of their humanity. The prisoners, once so broken, began to find strength in one another. They wrote not just to communicate with their families, but to communicate with each other, to share their fears, their hopes, and their solidarity. In this simple act, they reasserted control over their own identities. They were no longer simply the sum of their captivity. They were men with a past and, perhaps, a future. The letters, though small and often frail, carried the weight of something much larger, the quiet but unshakable belief that no matter how much their bodies were beaten, their spirits could still soar. The guards, for their part, found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. They had no clear response to what was happening. The prisoners were not rising up in violent rebellion. They were not striking back with force. Instead, they were using the simplest of tools, pen and paper, to regain what had been taken from them. The guards could not stop it, for there was nothing in the rules of engagement that accounted for such a quiet, humble form of resistance. And so, the letters continued to flow, a small but powerful act of defiance in the face of an overwhelming war. As the days unfolded in the camp, the once muted atmosphere began to change, subtly yet irrevocably. The prisoners, long trapped in a world of unrelenting brutality, had been granted a brief respite, a fleeting but potent opportunity to reclaim something of themselves that had been stripped away in the endless grind of warfare. The exchange of letters, which had initially started as an unexpected and solitary act of defiance, had now taken on a deeper significance. What had begun as a simple personal rebellion against the dehumanizing conditions of the camp had quietly blossomed into a movement of sorts, one that, though without banners or speeches, began to ripple through the hearts of the prisoners like a silent uprising. The initial shock among the men, who had been accustomed to the constant drumbeat of misery and punishment, gradually gave way to something resembling hope, a fragile but real emotion. It wasn't a hope for escape or liberation, not yet. No one dared to think that far ahead. But it was a hope for something much more immediate, something that transcended their daily suffering. A hope that they still mattered, that their lives were not entirely consumed by the unforgiving machinery of war. It was a hope that was expressed not in grand gestures or violent resistance but in the simple, almost sacred act of writing words to loved ones, words that proved they were still alive, still capable of human connection. For the first time in months, the men were allowed, even encouraged, to express themselves. What followed was a slow, steady transformation. The prisoners, some of whom had barely spoken in months, began to engage in quiet conversations about their letters. A camaraderie, long dormant, began to emerge among the men. They gathered in small groups, sitting on the cold stone floors of their barracks or leaning against the wooden slats of the camp fences, speaking in hushed tones about the letters they had written or the words they longed to send. It wasn't just the act of writing that mattered, it was the connection it brought. The simple, human need for interaction, for affection, for family. These men, who had been stripped of their identities, now found a way to assert themselves. They were no longer mere numbers, victims of war, or faceless captives. They were men with stories, with families, with voices. Their letters were a testament to that fact. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, who had been one of the first to follow Captain Harris's lead, found himself growing more and more connected to the men around him. At first, he had written his letter with a quiet, almost desperate need to reassure his wife that he was alive. But as the days passed, his letters began to take on a new purpose. They were no longer just messages home. They were lifelines to a world he had almost forgotten existed. He wrote not only to his wife but to his children, to his parents. The words came slowly at first, each sentence weighed down by the uncertainty of his situation. But as the letters continued, he found that his thoughts became clearer, his emotions more defined. The act of writing gave him something to hold on to in a world that had become increasingly fragmented. Each word was a stitch in the fabric of his humanity, a small but crucial act of resistance against the forces that sought to erase him. As more and more prisoners began to take part in this strange, subversive ritual, a quiet solidarity began to form among them. The letters became more than just personal expressions. They became symbols of shared experience, of common suffering. The men exchanged their letters with one another, reading aloud passages they found especially poignant or touching. They began to understand, in a way that transcended the written word, that they were not alone. Despite the iron bars that separated them from the outside world, despite the immense gulf of suffering and hopelessness that lay between them and their families, they were connected. It was a fragile connection, to be sure, but it was real. In the days that followed, the German guards, unsure of how to handle this new development, began to grow more wary. At first, they had allowed the prisoners to write their letters with little thought. After all, it seemed so trivial, so insignificant in the face of the overwhelming violence and punishment they regularly meted out. They assumed that the letters, though a strange request, would be inconsequential. They had no idea that they were unwittingly facilitating the restoration of the prisoners' spirits, that this small act of permission was igniting a quiet revolution within the camp. But as the number of letters grew, as the prisoners began to engage more openly with each other, the guards started to grow uncomfortable. This was not the way things were supposed to work. They had expected submission, despair, and compliance, but now they faced something they could not control. The prisoners were not just taking back their identities in private. They were doing it in front of the guards, who were now uncertain of their role in this strange new dynamic. The guards began to question whether they should stop the letters entirely, but they found themselves caught in a moral quandary. What could they say? How could they stop the prisoners from writing when it was, in essence, a harmless act? They had been trained to break the prisoners through physical punishment and psychological torment, but this was different. The writing wasn't rebellion in the traditional sense. The prisoners were not armed with knives or guns. They had no plans to stage an uprising or to physically confront the guards. They were simply writing letters. And in doing so, they were gaining something the guards had not anticipated: control over their own lives, however small. For many of the prisoners, the act of writing letters became something akin to a spiritual release. The physical hardships of the camp, the hunger, the exhaustion, the constant surveillance, were still very real. But in that small corner of their existence, where they could take up pen and paper, they found a kind of peace. Writing allowed them to process the trauma they had been through, to confront the raw emotions that had been buried beneath layers of survival instinct. It was a way to preserve themselves, to ensure that they would not be completely consumed by the brutality of the camp. The words they wrote weren't just messages to their families. They were personal testaments, confessions of sorts, to the men they still were despite everything that had happened to them. In the letters, the prisoners found their voices again, reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost in the fog of war. In the barracks, a quiet but steady change was taking place. The men who had once been too broken, too afraid, to speak began to talk, first in small groups, then more openly. They shared their letters, read each other's words, and discussed their lives before the war. They spoke of their families, their homes, the small joys they had once taken for granted. For a brief moment, they were not prisoners. They were men who had lived and loved, who had known freedom and peace, however briefly. These moments of connection allowed them to remember who they had been before the war had taken everything from them. The letters were a bridge to the past, and in that bridge, the men found a way to transcend their present suffering. Captain Harris, who had started this act of quiet rebellion, found that his own emotional state began to change as well. What had once felt like a desperate, almost futile attempt to hold onto some semblance of normalcy had now become a way for him to process the horrors of his captivity. As the days wore on, he wrote more frequently, pouring out his thoughts and emotions onto the pages. The letters became a form of therapy for him, a way to vent his frustrations, his fears, and his dreams. He found that writing allowed him to express emotions that he had long buried under the weight of duty and discipline. He had been a leader of men, a man who had prided himself on his strength, on his ability to command. But now, in the depths of his captivity, he was reminded of his vulnerability, of his humanity. The letters brought him back to himself, allowing him to see, in his own words, the man he had once been, and the man he still had the potential to be, if he could somehow survive this ordeal. The days grew colder, the work more grueling, and yet the writing continued. It became not just a form of resistance, but a way of life for the prisoners. In the most unexpected of places, within the brutal confines of a German POW camp, a small but powerful revolution had taken root. And it had all started with a simple letter, written in secret, shared quietly, but ultimately profound in its capacity to restore what had been lost. The prisoners had found a way to fight back, not with force or violence, but with the power of the written word. And in doing so, they had changed not just the course of their own lives, but the very fabric of the camp itself. What had started as a solitary, small act of defiance had slowly transformed into a collective act of humanity. The guards, unable to fully comprehend the impact of the letters, began to withdraw into a silence that mirrored the prisoners' own quiet resistance. There was no overt violence, no chaos, just a subtle shift, a moral reversal in the most unlikely of places. The subtle but powerful change within the camp continued to unfold, gaining strength as the days passed, and with it, a sense of unease began to take root among the guards. What had started as an unexpected, almost absurdly simple act, a prisoner asking to write a letter, had grown into something neither the captors nor the prisoners could have anticipated. The act of writing letters, initially perceived as a harmless indulgence, had become a symbol of something far greater, a quiet, internal rebellion against the harsh, dehumanizing conditions of the camp. It was not a rebellion of force, nor one of armed conflict. It was a rebellion of spirit, a slow, deliberate reclaiming of identity and dignity. The German guards, many of whom had been hardened by the brutality of the war, had never encountered such a form of resistance before. They were used to prisoners breaking under the weight of physical punishment, to men succumbing to despair or giving in to hopelessness. The guards were accustomed to seeing their captives as broken, as less than men. Yet, in the weeks that followed the initial letter-writing event, something had begun to shift within the ranks of the prisoners. The letters they wrote were not just personal messages sent home. They were symbols of survival, of humanity that could not be erased even in the most unimaginable of circumstances. Each word written was a silent assertion of their worth, a defiance of the very forces that had sought to strip them of their identity. As the number of letters increased, so too did the conversations among the prisoners. At first, it had been a simple matter of writing to family members, messages of reassurance, words of hope for a future that seemed increasingly distant. But as the days passed, the letters took on a deeper, more complex significance. They were no longer just messages to loved ones. They had become an act of remembrance. They allowed the prisoners to reconnect with the lives they had once lived, with the people they had once been. In a camp where every part of a man's identity had been consumed by the war, by the violence, by the cruelty, the letters offered a way to reassert a sense of self. They became a means of confronting the trauma, of processing the suffering, and of holding on to the memories that defined who they were before the war had taken it all. For many of the men, writing the letters was not an easy task. The words didn't come easily, and often, they had to force themselves to think of something to write. Their minds had been so numbed by the relentless brutality of the camp that they could barely remember what it felt like to be happy, to be loved, to be part of something larger than themselves. And yet, despite the mental exhaustion, despite the emotional toll the war had taken on them, the letters came. They flowed, slowly at first, but then with greater urgency. The act of writing became a ritual, a daily task that offered a sense of normalcy, of order, in a life that had become chaotic and unpredictable. Each prisoner, sitting hunched over a scrap of paper in the cold barracks, was reconnecting with the very essence of who they were. Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, whose letters had become a form of personal therapy, found himself drawing strength from the act of writing. At first, his letters had been sparse, filled with little more than the barest assurances to his wife and children. But as the weeks wore on, they became deeper, more introspective. He found himself writing not only about his daily life in the camp but about the emotions he had never allowed himself to express. The hopelessness he felt, the fear of never seeing his family again, the guilt over the things he had witnessed. These were the things he had been holding inside, and now, in the quiet safety of his letters, he allowed himself to confront them. It was in these words that he began to release the burden that had weighed so heavily on him. The letters were no longer just a means of communication. They had become a form of emotional release, a way for him to process his trauma and find some semblance of peace in a world that had been defined by chaos and violence. But it wasn't just the officers like Lieutenant Hayes who found solace in the letters. The men who had once been too broken, too beaten down, to even think of writing began to follow suit. They wrote not only to their families but to each other. There were messages of solidarity, of shared pain, of a mutual understanding that transcended the barriers of rank and background. It became clear that the simple act of writing was something more than just a personal affair. It was a form of collective resistance. The prisoners, once divided by their different backgrounds and nationalities, began to unite through their shared experience of suffering. The letters, though private, had created a sense of brotherhood, an unspoken bond that tied them together in ways nothing else could. The guards could see it. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, and it made them uneasy. The letters also began to change the dynamic within the camp. Before, the prisoners had lived in a kind of enforced isolation. They were disconnected from one another, divided by their suffering and their circumstances. But the writing of letters brought them together. Men who had barely spoken to each other now gathered in small groups to share their thoughts, to discuss what they had written or received. The simple exchange of letters became an act of mutual support. In a place where every gesture of kindness was rare, the prisoners found strength in each other. They shared stories of their families, of the lives they had left behind, of the things they missed. They began to remember, together, what it was like to be free, to live without the constant threat of violence. The guards, for their part, were growing more uncertain. They had initially allowed the prisoners to write letters, assuming that it was just a harmless distraction. But as the letters grew in number and frequency, and as the prisoners began to exchange them openly, they found themselves at a loss. What could they do? The prisoners were not openly rebelling. They were not defying the camp's rules in any overt way. But what they were doing, writing letters, sharing them, talking openly about their lives, was something that fundamentally altered the balance of power. The prisoners were taking control of their own lives, even within the confines of the camp. It was a form of resistance that could not be easily silenced. The guards found themselves in a strange position. They had no clear response to the prisoners' behavior. Should they continue to allow the letters? Should they stop them altogether? It wasn't a question that could be easily answered. In the midst of all this, something else was happening, something even more profound than the writing itself. The prisoners were beginning to feel the weight of their own survival. They had endured months, even years, of unimaginable hardship. They had been beaten, starved, and worked to the point of exhaustion. But through it all, they had held on to something that could not be taken away. The letters were a reminder of that. They were a reminder that they had not been erased, that they still mattered, that they still had a voice. It was as if, by writing to their families, they were reminding themselves that they were not lost. And in this small act of reclaiming their humanity, the prisoners began to feel a deep, almost unspoken shift in the way they saw themselves. They were not just victims of the war. They were not simply pawns in a larger game. They were men, individuals, and their lives had value. For Captain Harris, the man who had started it all, the letters had become a kind of touchstone. When he first wrote his letter, he had done so almost as an afterthought, unsure of what would come of it. But now, weeks later, as he looked around the camp, he saw something he had never expected to see. He saw men who had once been hollow, who had been broken by the horrors of war, now standing taller. He saw prisoners who had lived for months in a state of numbness and resignation now speaking to each other, sharing their stories, offering comfort. He saw the same men who had once shrunk in fear now writing letters with pride, each word a small victory in the face of overwhelming odds. The camp, which had once been a place of misery and despair, now felt different. It was as though the letters had turned the tide, turning the prisoners from victims into agents of their own lives, even in the most unimaginable of circumstances.